Welcome to Lawgical, the UAE's first and only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott, and I'm here with the managing partner of the Dubai-based legal firm HBL Yamalova and Plethka here in Dubai, Ludmila Yamalova. Good to see you again.
Good to be here with you, Tim.
Now, today, Ludmila, we've done a couple of podcasts on civil marriages in the past. We're doing a new one today. It's big news. Civil marriages. If you are Muslim in the UAE, you can now get married in a civil ceremony at the Abu Dhabi Civil Family Court.
Yes, and it is big news. As you succinctly summarized it, Muslims in the UAE can now actually opt for a civil marriage. And that's as long as they're not UAE nationals. And they can do this through the Abu Dhabi Judicial Department or ADJD, and in particular the Abu Dhabi Civil Family Court. So a little bit of history as in terms of how this came to be. So by way of reminder, and we've talked about it in previous podcasts, at the end of 2021, Abu Dhabi introduced its own specific law, which was previously called, I think it was civil marriages or for non-Muslim expats. Right. And if my memory serves me right, I think that particular law, it was law number 14 of 2021, came at end of October or November of 2021. Then, only about a month later, in mid-December of 2021, the name of that law was changed, and so were some provisions. So just a month later. And so the non-Muslim and expat terms were taken out. And so, and then it became ultimately the name was the name of the law became civil marriages and its effects. So specifically, or in other words, the previous not just a draft, but previous version of the law that referred to non-Muslim and expats, those phrases and those terms were taken out. And this became, I guess, perhaps it was logical because at that point in time, also the UAE had amended its citizenship law, ultimately allowing perhaps for more categories of people to apply for UAE nationality, which meant that at that point in time, and perhaps in the future, there'd be more UAE nationals who are not Muslims. So that's why limiting it to expats would be unfair to those UAE nationals who are not Muslims. So that's why that particular term was taken out of the law. And that's obviously my own speculation as to I wasn't behind the scenes in drafting the law or amending it, but certainly my analysis or interpretation of the events. And also somehow in the process the non-Muslim term was also taken out. So which back then just gave us a lot of pause and sort of scratching of our heads. Does this mean what we think it means? I.e., does this mean that these sort of civil services or civil marriages and resulting services will become available to Muslims of the UAE? So while the language of the law did not specifically make it very clear that Muslims can also avail themselves of these services, there were no more limitations in the law, as was in the previous or in the original version, to these services and this law applying only to non-Muslims. Furthermore, there was a provision in terms of who can avail themselves of these services to, and there's a whole category, so there's a list of who can avail, the non-Muslims, so on and so forth. But then the last kind of a catch-all, or whoever else wants to benefit from basically this civil law. So that, once again, we're also scratching our heads thinking, does that mean what we think it means? And now it's been about a year and a half since the law was introduced, and since this particular law comes out of it's Abu Dhabi law, and it's governed by it's under the umbrella of ADJD. When you go on the ADJD website, it actually, so in addition, so remember, the law does not specifically state this service is available or this law is available for Muslims. Now, when you go on the ADJD website for these specific services, and that is the civil marriage itself or the wills, it actually clearly as part on the website, it says that this service is available for Muslims.
Right.
And there's a bit of a difference here because as lawyers, we obviously only can rely on what's in the law. So the law does not clearly state this is available for Muslims, but equally so, it does not exclude Muslims, as was the case before. But the Abu Dhabi or the court website that makes these services available and through which you apply for these services clearly states that Muslims can avail themselves of these services. So that kind of scratching of our heads, originally has basically, we're like, could this be what we think it is, has now been confirmed. It actually is exactly what we were secretly perhaps hoping for, only because I've been practicing law in the UAE for almost 15 years now, and we've seen over the years there have been so many requests from Muslims, non-UAE nationals, from, let's say, Muslims from the UK, from France, from the US, who wanted to, for example, either have a civil marriage or have a will. And the answer was always, well, as long as you're Muslim in the UAE, you're considered as a Muslim, and therefore you're subject to the UAE personal status law, which is based on principles of Sharia. Therefore, as a Muslim, in short, you cannot vary that. So that's how things used to be, but our kind of speculation prediction of what this law, the purpose or the objective of this law was going to be for the time being, has proven true. So now, for purposes of Muslims wanting to get married in a civil ceremony, it is now possible. So as per this, not just the law itself, but as ADJD's own expressed instructions, then civil marriages are now available for Muslims, except the UAE nationals. That service is not available for UAE nationals, and that's also pretty specifically stated on the website. Now, all Muslims can avail themselves of these civil marriage ceremony and services, much the same way as these services are available for non-Muslims.
So no more lawyers scratching their heads. I always think it's a good sign when a lawyer is not scratching their head, because you've got something there written down that is explicit and you can refer to. Also, your legal knowledge, Ludmila, as ever, is so impressive. It is law number 14 of 2021. It is civil marriages and its effects in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi as well. So kudos for getting that exactly right, I have to say.
I remember the evolution of that law. That's why I even remember the dates. It was like November, December. Just within 1 month, the law was so substantively changed. It was really impressive, and it was very hopeful. And so I'm glad that our hopes are coming true.
It's the case here, isn't it? So much has changed. So much has progressed in very recent times. Let's talk a little bit more about civil marriages, what you need to do, how you apply, the ins and outs.
For sure. So one is, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, one of the big benefits of perhaps most court services in the UAE now, but certainly for the purpose of ADJD, is that everything is done online. Yeah. It's through ADJD website. Yeah. Now, you don't need to set up your own separate kind of court portal, as perhaps you may need to do with other courts, like the Dubai courts being one example. You log into ADJD through your UAE Pass. And as part of once you've logged in, though, you'll see a service that is basically for civil marriages, and you apply for that service to basically civil marriage. Now, the only documents you need to submit is basically your identification documents, and if you want to have a prenuptial agreement, you can also submit that, but it's optional. And if there was a previous divorce or previous marriage sort of in the couple, then they can also submit those documents that marriage is no more, either by virtue of divorce decree or a death certificate, for example. And that's basically it. And now this is another perhaps significant benefit for Muslims, because previously for Muslims to get married in the UAE, they were always required to, in addition to all the sort of the identification documents and such, they were always required to have guardian approval. And guardian present there, guardian approval, and also medical tests.
Right.
So those requirements were not present for non-Muslims getting married in the UAE, for example, through religious ceremonies. But those two requirements were always present for all Muslims getting married in the UAE. Right. And so, while medical test is perhaps not such a big deal, but with regards to getting guardian approval, it was a fairly significant issue for many whose guardians don't live in the UAE. Because remember, this applies to Muslims of the Muslim residents of the UAE who are not nationals, which means expats. And if you're an expat, for many Muslims, they don't necessarily have families living here close by, i.e., don't necessarily have their fathers living here. And for Muslims, for a woman particularly to get married, she would have needed to have, as by default, father's approval, father's presence for the marriage. And for many people, that was not an option because their parents were not here, or could not fly here so easily. So this is a huge benefit for all those Muslims who perhaps find themselves in those situations. Because here under the ADJD, you don't need to present, or you don't need to present your guardian's approval. So therefore, your father does not need to be there. Obviously, you can invite whoever you want to invite.
Sure.
But certainly their approval and their sign-off and presence for the marriage itself is not required, which is a huge benefit. So once you submit your application, then the ADJD will send a link or confirmation that they've received your application. You also have to pay a fee. It's 950 dirhams, 300 dirhams for a simple application. But if you want expedited, it's 2,500 dirhams. And then you will receive a confirmation from ADJD that they have received your application. And they will then, you can actually request your wedding date, on which date you want to get married, but ultimately subject to confirmation by ADJD. Then they follow up, within a few days after you've submitted your application, they'll follow up with actually the exact date when you can come and administer your marriage. That, by the way, for the time being, still happens in physical form. So you actually need to travel to ADJD or to Abu Dhabi and present yourself to ADJD to have your civil ceremony conducted in the presence of the authorities and the judges and representatives there. So unlike, for example, wills, registration of wills, where it's all done online, for purposes of civil marriage, you still need to physically be present. Perhaps not a bad thing because it is kind of a big life decision. So then you get confirmation of when the appointment is set, and then you arrive on the day of the appointment with the confirmation from the ADJD that your application has been submitted and the appointment date, and also a copy of your application, your original documents, obviously with your partner, with your spouse to be, and also you can even invite your guests. So they just need to present their identification documents, and it's a fairly quick process. Happens at ADJD. You sign the documents, and then shortly thereafter you receive your marriage certificate. Now, for Muslims in particular, the marriage certificate, by the way, is issued by Abu Dhabi Judicial Department. So it's issued by the authority and the official authority and the judicial authority.
This is an automatically attested document, if you like, isn't it?
For purposes of the UAE, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, it is advised, in particular for Muslims, to also take that certificate and attest it by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the UAE, or MOFA, which is a very easy, more administrative process. Mm-hmm. But it's advisable to do so. So it's just another kind of a stamp of approval, especially for Muslims, because it's such a new service. And also that would, for the future, whenever you want to use the certificate in other jurisdictions or for other purposes, having the UAE Ministry MOFA stamp would be just an added benefit.
Yeah. Okay. I think that pretty much covers it, really. Is there anything we've missed? Any other points that you think are relevant that you'd like to make?
No, I think we've kind of covered it all. I just want to re-emphasize the importance of the groundbreaking idea or notion of this option now being available in the UAE. How far we've moved and how fast we've moved. As I mentioned earlier, I've been here for so long, and I've had so many requests over the years, people wanting to have a civil marriage. Also, one more important thing is that what ends up happening is that, because remember, the law is called civil marriages and its effects. So therefore, in the event of, for example, a divorce, in the future, or issues of custody and guardianship or inheritance. Now, by definition, a couple that got married under ADJD and under this law number 14, then they're subject, their relationship, and so it's called the effects of the marriage. So the relationship is governed by this law. So in other words, let's say in the event of a divorce, which law would apply to the divorce? Because in the past, and we know so many people in the UAE who are of different nationalities, different religions, different ethnicities, and their kids can have even yet different passports in addition to that. So in the event of the divorce, the big question was always which law applies to the divorce. Is it the law of the husband? Is it the law of the mother? Is it the law of the UAE? Is it the law? And also, don't forget, a lot of people here have multiple citizenships, right? Or is it the law of where they got married? Or is it the law of where they live now, or one of the other parties? I mean, there's so many different laws that could have applied and in the past and used to be sort of argued often. But the particular idea. But now, if you get married under ADJD, you're governed by this law. So therefore, your divorce is governed, and the law is pretty substantive in terms of and detailed in terms of what happens in terms of division of assets. Similarly, with regards to guardianship, same thing. If you get married under ADJD in the event of a divorce, the law itself is very specific. The guardianship, for example, is split 50-50. So if you choose to have a civil marriage, even if you're Muslims, then under this law, when you decide to divorce, your divorce would be subject to the same law, which means the guardianship will be 50-50. So the mother has and the father has, unlike, for example, unlike what would normally happen if the UAE personal status law applied to Muslims divorcing. And similarly for inheritance. So this is important, is that basically once you choose to get married under ADJD, you no longer need to argue, it should be the law of Lebanon versus US or Australia versus France, for example, or whatever multiple nationalities or citizenships that you may hold. So you have now one law that applies to not just the marriage, but all the other effects of the marriage.
That is another edition of Lawgical, Civil Marriages for Muslims in the UAE, and it is now possible. As ever, thanks for watching, listening, or both. Thanks to our legal expert, managing partner at Yamalova and Plethka, Ludmila Yamalova. Thank you.
My pleasure.
You can find us at LY Law, social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. Our podcasts are free at lylawyers.com. To have a legal question answered in a future episode of Lawgical, or to talk to a qualified UAE experienced legal professional, click the contact button at lylawyers.com.